Do you think there's any chance that NATO would do something as crazy as take Kaliningrad? Because there was that statement, I know you heard of it from, I forget the
Yeah,
guy's name, some general,
I think it was
said we
Christopher
could.
Donahue, I believe. Oh, it's very worrying. I found that kind of shocking. It's just like, what was the point of that statement? Is it because they worry that people are starting to look at NATO as a paper tiger? The narrative is starting to just look a little kind of ragged around the edges, and they need to spruce it up and to reinvigorate it. It was an alarming kind of statement to make. Kaliningrad is Russia. It's part of Russia. It's, an attack. You're talking about attacking Russia. Um, yeah, there has been a lot of actually very bellicose statements made by European political leaders, and both on both sides of the Atlantic, especially in the UK and Germany, but also Poland. Um, and you hear again, that they don't just predict that there might be a war, but they seem to expect that there will be a war. They tell their people that they need to prepare for a war against Russia in the next 2 to 5 years. And yeah, it's not just one or two leaders that have said that, but a dozen over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and it's quite alarming. I don't really know what's going on. It's again, um, it's probably all just rhetoric. It's a lot of chest beating. Maybe it's for them. They don't really have any plans to do anything. But you're left to wonder. It's just, do they really mean it when they expect war with Russia in 2 to 5 years?
Right. I think for the average everyday citizen living in Europe or the US, we don't feel like we're at war with Russia. But the problem is that there are parts of our government or the deep state that are already in that mindset that we're at war with Russia. And I think that's embodied in our intelligence agencies, CIA,
Hmm.
MI6. And their mindset, in their mind, I think they already know they're at war with Russia because they are, right? Would you think that's a correct way to
Hmm.
frame it? That these intelligence agencies, because we've heard them, the MI6 involved with things from Curse to potentially Operation Spiderweb, direct attacks, all these drone attacks into Russia, that's being, conducted by or orchestrated in large part by intelligence agencies like the MI6 and CIA. We know that the CIA had over 15 bases in eastern Ukraine prior to the SMO. And we know that we've been laying out all of the framework, and these CIAs, they have these black budgets, these black boxes. Who knows how much money's going in? They're controlling it. They are fully involved in this war. In terms of the intelligence side, we are at
Yeah,
war with Russia, right? And that's what's so scary. And then they can use their
yeah,
levers of power to try to push the rest of the government into war with Russia because this is their game.
hmm
Do you think that's accurate
yeah,
to say that
yeah. No,
our
it's well, yeah. Again, it's more than just a proxy war. Maybe we can't say we are directly at war with them, but we are. We're in this
I'm
gray
saying
area between, a typical proxy war and direct war. It's not that our troops are on the ground in uniforms in any significant numbers actually shooting at Russian troops. Thank God that that's not happening yet, or that our fighter pilots have invaded Russian airspace and are, firing missiles or dropping bombs on Russian territory. But as you point, we provide the intelligence, we provide target data, and we train, and then we know that, um, you know, actually, again, from the generals themselves, that they have been involved. They haven't just, again, supplied the weapons and given suggestions, but they've actually become involved in the, at the tactical level in these battles. Actually you know, provide targets again at the tactical level. Hit there's a unit on top of this hill or in this tree line. Hit them. You know, this is direct involvement. Um, and then, again, of course, there is the ATACMS that when they're launched, they're not launched by Ukraine by themselves, but we are actually launching those missiles. And it would certainly be true of Tomahawks or JASSMs. Um, So yeah, we are, maybe it's not quite right to say that we are at war with them, but we're very nearly at war with them. We're in this gray area again between a proxy war and a direct war. These intelligence agencies and NATO generals, they know it, and they've put their reputations on the line. And for them, this is becoming something of an existential struggle, at least, if not really for Europe, because look, Russia doesn't have any intention of invading Europe. It is existential for them. I think that's how they perceive it. This is like, if they lose this, it could very well be the end of NATO, or if NATO survives, it's never going to be the same NATO. We're going to look at it as something different. It went into this war again as, the most feared and supposedly the most successful, the most powerful military alliance in history. But if we are soundly defeated in Ukraine, because it really will be a NATO project, whatever we say, and they know it is, and I think most of the world knows that it is too. It's even if NATO holds together, it's just not going to be the same NATO. It's going to be its stature will be greatly reduced. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, if you're saying that we're providing targeting data and actually directing the battlefield in a large extent, then certain agencies, parts of the government, are at war with Russia already. And so it's just, like he said, we're in this gray zone already. And that's dangerous because we're just moving further and further. And if we're able to have people like a general of the United States Army to say, yeah, we can take Kaliningrad in 24 or 48 hours, like and people aren't freaking out about that. It just shows you how far we've gone. I mean, imagine, we heard Russia saying, okay, yeah, we can take Alaska back. It could take us, we can take Fairbanks in, 2 days, 3 days, something like this, like how crazy that statement would be, and how much news that would make. But then we have a U.S. general here. Sure, it's causing some stir, but mainly just within this dissident community. But most people are just like, yeah, okay, whatever, just saying, well, that's just the U.S. doing what it does. And I don't think people are realizing how dangerous this can come. And if people are apathetic about these types of statements, it just shows you that we're in trouble, that we are kind of at war, and it just nuts. It's just nuts. I can't believe this.
Yeah, Kaliningrad is Russia. You take Kaliningrad, you have invaded Russia, you have started World War III. And Kaliningrad is where, various kinds of strategic weapons, including nuclear missiles, I believe, are based. You take Kaliningrad, you have started World War III, and it could very well go nuclear. And the Russians responded very strongly to that. They noticed, they heard that statement, and they said, yeah, you take Kaliningrad, and we could very well have a nuclear war.
Right. And, we have what he said, the Polish president said, yeah, we'll be at war with Russia in 2027. There's been quite a few political leaders, right, that are just sort of saying, get ready to prepare for war with Russia. So it's just like their mind's made up, and it's just like, this is insane. Well, and I'm kind of surprised that we're not getting more of a pushback. People are we're slowly slipping into this, and it's just
right. Again, this is the political class. It's not the people of Europe. The German generals, for example, really want to build up their army. And maybe this is part of it. Possibly, you can look at this very cynically. All this talk about war with Russia, it may be just a way of, increasing budgets. You have to have a boogeyman. You have to scare the people, get them to cough up more money, to agree to, cuts in services and so on and so forth. So you scare them, and maybe that's all it is. You wonder, because we do have a real, a near war going on. Again, this proxy war, and more than a proxy war in Ukraine. But yeah, again, the Ukrainian generals want to build up their army, but they just don't have. There's really very little interest, within the population. Young people don't want to sign up. They're just not. The same thing is true in the UK and other countries. There's very, very little enthusiasm. So again, that's just sort of what's always given me some hope, is clearly there are leaders, political and military within Europe, that are champing at the bit, who really seem to want war. And again, Macron himself and Starmer, and Merz, they often talk that way. At least these are men that seem to really want war. But maybe they're just not going to have their war because their people are not going to go along with it. Let's hope so.
Well, what's the state of Ukraine now? I saw some Western media headline. I forget which newspaper had it, but it was saying that Ukraine is severely attrited now. Openly admitting that they are no longer able to replenish the manpower or weaponry, so that it's starting to break through a bit more through the West. But we've been talking about the possibility of, is Ukraine collapsing? It seems like for a year, like it always seems like things have been looking bad ever since after the summer offensive, but they just hold on and they just grind, and the casualties keep on amounting. They keep on being attrited. It's horrible for the Ukrainians. They're just getting just pummeled constantly. But are we actually, would you say we're coming to a collapse now finally, or?
I honestly don't know. I know I hear a lot of, like, my fellow commentators are saying that there's a real acceleration. When I look at the statistics, it doesn't look really very different from last year. I think we're still not where we were in the fall of last year. We're not, I should say Russia is not advancing, still not as fast as it was, let's say, in November of last year. Faster than it was at this time a year ago, but not much faster. That was after the fall of Avdiivka. There are important advances, and Pokrovsk is important. It looks like, they've actually penetrated into Pokrovsk, and they continue to extend the pinchers around it. Pokrovsk, is going to fall, and it might fall faster than we thought. But that, Pokrovsk, if you look at the whole, map of Ukraine, or even like the eastern half of it, it's an important logistical hub. There's no question about it. It's important because it's like the first city in a series of cities leading up to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And it will be I think it's fair to say that's the beginning of the end for Donetsk. But Donetsk is just actually one oblast, one region. And the Russians have committed to also taking Zaporozhye, and they still got a long ways to go on Zaporozhye. And Zaporozhye city is huge. It's much, much larger than, Pokrovsk. And then Kherson, and to get to regain the rest of Kherson, they have to cross the river, and that's going to be very hard. There are a lot of, when I look at it, it seems to me that we still have a lot of war to fight. And though, there are signs, I think it's true, there's no question about it, that that Ukrainian defenses are becoming increasingly thin, and they may very well be on the verge of collapse. But as you say, I've been hearing this for like 2 years. So I'm just, one of these days it's going to be true. We'll see it, but I'm not seeing it quite yet. When I'm reading the accounts of the different battles, the Ukrainians are still throwing in reinforcements, still trying these counterattacks. And they're still fighting hard in a lot of these places and slowing the Russians down. The counterattacks are very rarely successful. They usually don't do anything, and they just end up, killing a lot of Ukrainians. Sometimes they manage to take back, let's say, half a village, but then definitely within a week, the Russians take it again. And that happens. But it does slow the Russians down. They're able to slow them down on several points. And so it looks like, the same old thing, but that again, that's the way it is with the war of attrition. And we can think about it in the case of World War I. I mean, those lines hardly moved at all for a long time. And then finally the lines did collapse. It may be right around the corner, but I'm not holding my breath. It could be, in a few more months before we start to see a collapse. It might be a whole year, who knows, or even longer. I think there's still a lot of war to be fought. And the Russians are being careful. I think, we know that they have all these troops in reserve, well-equipped units. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of men. They could throw them in. But I think, I know within Russia, there's a lot of debate about this. There are a lot of Russians who think that the Russian command is being too cautious. and they need to just bring this war to an end. And, but for whatever reason, the Russians haven't done that. And part of it is that they are being careful, very careful with Russian lives. And, it's easy for us standing back here, so yeah, big aero offensive, let's whatever. But just imagine if it's your son that's on the front line in one of those units, you would want them to be really careful, right?
Right. When the Russians come in and take these cities like Pokrovsk, or if they march on to Zaporozhye, which you said is a large city, do they get emptied out largely before the fighting starts, or like?
Right.
Well, what happens to the people living there?
Yeah, most of them are evacuated. Most of them leave the city. There are always some hangers-on, some who just do not want to leave their properties and just want to wait for the Russians. And I remember that happened in Avdiivka, for example. Avdiivka was really pummeled. There were hundreds and hundreds of FABs, these huge, 1 ton, 2 ton bombs dropped on Avdiivka. But when the Russians took it, these people, a lot of older men and women came out of their basements and hugged the Russian soldiers. I think we're talking about a pretty small part of the population, maybe 1%, 2%, 3% or something, but they just stay. And I think that's probably true in Pokrovsk.
Okay, yeah, I'm wondering because while we're still in the Donbass and Zaporozhye, these are regions that were largely sympathetic to Russia. So I'm just wondering if the civilians,
very sympathetic.
Right. So the civilians that are living there in these cities, do they feel occupied fully by the Ukrainians? And, when the Russians come and take it, if they fled for safety, they can't go back to their city, right? Because now it's Russian occupied territory. Ukraine won't let them, right? So, what is that? What happens?
It's going to be hard, I guess. Right. Yeah, well, that's a good question. I wondered about that. I think, that there are ways to get. There's certainly ways to get to Russia. If they're allowed to leave Ukraine, there's always ways to enter Russia, via a third country. So I think that's probably what a lot of these people are doing. It's just, I can't blame them. Yeah, I would rather, if I were a resident of a city like Pokrovsk, I would rather be there under Russian occupation. I think the great majority of the residents think that way. But, for the Russians to take Pokrovsk, they've got to pummel it because the Ukrainian soldiers are using these buildings as fortresses. This is they're using the basements, and they're using the, apartment towers as fortresses. They have their gun nests up there on the higher floors. And so a great deal of damage is done to these cities because they're fought within the cities. And so it's got to be, first of all, a terrifying experience, and then a real chance that you're going to be killed. So even if I want to be, under Russian occupation, I don't want to live through this battle. So a lot of these people do agree to be evacuated, but there's always a hardcore,
I'm not leaving.
A few, again, it just maybe a couple percent. Yeah, I am. Yeah. I think that's always true, actually, like in India, I'm not leaving this house, and they stay.
Right.
And some of them do get killed, but others survive, and they are able to welcome the Russian soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of wonder if you're a Ukrainian occupying these cities that are in eastern Ukraine, places like Pokrovsk, are you not worried if the majority of citizens are sympathetic to Russia? I mean, do they view these citizens as potential informants or enemies? Or do they realize they're not wanted there? Like, I think that's something that
right.
I was just going to say, I think most people that don't have a firm understanding of the conflict in Ukraine just to assume that, okay, yeah, Russia's invading and that everybody's in eastern Ukraine is like these evil Russian barbarians are coming through and, burning our cities and raping our women and killing our men. That's the image that they try to present without realizing that actually these people have been involved in a civil war since 2014, right? Fighting against the Western Ukraine, that this really was a civil war conflict, and that the majority of these people in eastern Ukraine are Russian speakers, identify as Russians. Their rights have been trampled since the overthrow of their democratic elected government in 2014. They have been waging this war for a long time. Yeah, and so, but it just makes me wonder, like all these people, it makes me feel like I'm surprised that there aren't more uprisings. I wonder how Ukraine's able to kind of control a population, in Eastern Ukraine that doesn't want to be under their control.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they've got all the guns, that's
okay. Yeah.
And, organized violence, it's numbers, you can, right. Maybe, how it is, right? Yeah. I think the majority of the people in these towns in Eastern Ukraine and Donetsk do not want to be under Ukrainian control, want to be part of Russia. If I remember correctly, it was actually the rebellion that set off the civil war, the rebellion against the new Ukrainian regime that took power in 2014, started in the Kramatorsk-Slavyansk area. So again, that's where it started. Okay? So when the Russians get there, there's going to be a sense, finally, this is this objective was achieved. No, recently I haven't heard anything, but I remember in the first year or two of the war that you would hear accounts from Ukrainian soldiers, actually complaints, saying the people here they're all pro-Russian, just really annoyed by the fact, but they admitted it was true.
Yeah. Well, do you think this war you said you think it can grind down a lot more? There's a lot more war left. Do you think this is going to extend well into 2026? Even, do you think this is going to evolve? Will we have direct NATO involvement?
Yeah, well, that's the fear. This is the thing. This is the argument too that I've heard from both sides. Like Jim Jatras and others. I think a lot of people within Russia. He's not Russian, but he's very closely tied to Russia. He was a former State Department employee. And says that he thinks it actually increases the danger of NATO involvement just by extending the war, by going at it slowly. That eventually,
I agree.
I can understand his point. I see it. And now others like Eve Smith, she's made the argument of naked capitalism, that you don't make any sudden moves around a crazy person. She puts it that way. It's actually the Russians want to move slowly because a sudden move, like a sudden breakthrough, a big aero offensive, a sudden march on Kiev, that could, provoke an hysterical, reckless response by the West.
Right.
But I can see both sides of it. I understand, I can see both sides of this argument.